In 1856, a single photograph emerged from a plantation in rural Mississippi that would haunt historians for over 160 years. The daguerreotype showed Colonel Nathaniel Ashford standing beside three young women, his daughters, and a towering enslaved man named Samuel. What appeared to be a simple family portrait concealed a systematic program of forced reproduction that would create one of the most disturbing dynasties in American slavery history. The photograph disappeared into private collections for decades, surfaced briefly in the 1920s, then vanished again until 2019, when a descendant donated it to a regional historical society. What archivists discovered in cross-referencing birth records, plantation ledgers, and genetic testing of living descendants revealed a calculated breeding program orchestrated by the colonel himself, using his own daughters as unwilling participants in his vision of a superior bloodline. The case exposes not only the depths of slavery's cruelty, but also how wealthy families manipulated genealogical records to erase evidence of forced reproductive programs. For over a century, the Ashford name remained untarnished in Mississippi society, their fortune built on cotton and secrecy. The silence was so complete that even descendants of the colonel's daughters grew up believing sanitized family myths, until DNA evidence shattered every carefully constructed lie. This is the story of how one photograph, one breeding program, and three silenced daughters created a dynasty founded on systematic sexual coercion that the American South tried desperately to forget. 169 years ago, in a plantation house overlooking endless cotton fields in Noxubee County, Mississippi, a photographer captured an image that would later be described by historians as the most disturbing portrait of antebellum power dynamics ever preserved. Colonel Nathaniel Ashford commissioned the daguerreotype in spring 1856, positioning himself at the center with military precision. To his right stood his three daughters, Elizabeth, 17, Margaret, 16, and Catherine, 15. To his left stood Samuel, an enslaved man whose imposing physical presence dominated the frame despite his lowered gaze. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The photograph itself offers no obvious scandal at first glance. Families often posed with their enslaved workers in elaborate displays of paternalistic authority. But what made this particular image extraordinary was what the colonel wrote on the back in careful script. The foundation of our continuation, spring 1856. Those 7 words would remain cryptic for over 160 years, their meaning locked away in family vaults and deliberately obscured in official records. Colonel Ashford ran his plantation with military efficiency, having served in the Mexican-American War before inheriting his father's estate in 1849. His wife Eleanor died during childbirth in 1853, leaving him to raise 3 daughters alone, or so the official family history claimed. What the sanitized genealogies never mentioned was how the colonel's obsession with bloodline and inheritance transformed his daughters from grieving children into unwilling participants in a program that would destroy their lives. The plantation records from 1854 to 1860 show unusual patterns when cross-referenced with birth registries. Samuel, purchased from a Charleston auction house in 1853, appears repeatedly in the colonel's personal ledgers under a section titled Breeding Stock Inventory, a categorization usually reserved for livestock. More disturbing were the medical notations recorded by the plantation's physician, Dr. Cornelius Webb, whose journals surfaced in 2017 during an estate sale. Webb documented consultations regarding fertility protocols and monthly examinations of the colonel's female household members, with clinical detachment that barely masked his discomfort with what he was witnessing. Contemporary letters between the colonel and his brother reveal the ideology driving his actions. In correspondence dated November 1854, Ashford wrote, "The future of our family requires strategic enhancement. I have identified optimal genetic material and will ensure our line benefits from calculated improvement." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the program he was designing, one that would force his own daughters into bearing children with Samuel, creating mixed-race heirs who would be claimed as legitimate Ashford descendants through manipulated documentation. The community's silence was absolute. Neighboring plantation owners, local clergy, and county officials maintained a collective amnesia about what transpired at Ashford Manor between 1856 and 1860. Church records show the colonel's daughter stopped attending services after spring 1856. Social invitations ceased, The family withdrew into isolation, while the colonel's program progressed behind walls of Spanish moss and deliberate obscurity. Samuel's own history remains fragmentary. Auction records identify him as approximately 25 years of age, purchased from coastal holdings, exceptional physical specimen, no recorded history of resistance. The dehumanizing categorization stripped him of agency, while simultaneously marking him as valuable breeding stock in the colonel's twisted vision. Whether Samuel understood what was being demanded of him, whether he resisted or submitted under threat, these questions remain unanswered in historical records that treated enslaved people as property rather than human beings with voices worth preserving. The photograph captures this moment of enforced complicity. Elizabeth's hand rests rigidly on her father's shoulder. Not affection, but mandatory performance. Margaret's eyes stare past the camera into middle distance, her expression carefully blank. Catherine, the youngest, appears frozen in a smile that doesn't reach her eyes, and Samuel stands positioned as both threat and victim, his presence simultaneously essential to the colonel's plan and utterly disposable once that plan achieved its goal. What the photograph doesn't show are the months that followed. Birth records from 1857 register 3 children born within weeks of each other at Ashford Manor. The official documentation lists them as orphaned relations taken under family protection, a common legal fiction used by wealthy families to legitimize children born from enslaved women. But these weren't children of enslaved mothers. These were the colonel's own grandchildren, born from his daughters, fathered by the man standing in that 1856 photograph. The case remained buried because it implicated respected families, challenged racial hierarchies, and exposed the darkest applications of breeding programs that extended beyond enslaved populations. When Samuel disappeared from plantation records in late 1860, no investigation followed. When the colonel died in 1862 from injuries sustained during the Civil War, his daughters inherited an empire built on their own trauma, and a secret they would take to their graves. The photograph survived because someone in the family believed it needed to. Hidden in trunks passed through generations, resurfacing briefly before vanishing again. It waited for a time when its terrible story could finally be told. Understanding Colonel Nathaniel Ashford requires examining the ideology that transformed a grieving widower into an architect of systematic reproductive coercion. His military service shaped a worldview obsessed with strategy, control, and genetic optimization, concepts he applied to his family with the same precision he once commanded troops. Plantation ledgers and personal correspondence reveal a man who viewed his daughters not as children to protect, but as assets to leverage in creating what he called an enhanced bloodline capable of dominating future generations. The colonel's obsession began after his wife's death in 1853. Eleanor Ashford died delivering their 4th child, a son who survived only 3 days. The loss devastated Nathaniel, but grief transformed into something far more sinister, a conviction that his bloodline required strengthening to prevent future weakness. In letters to his brother James, a physician in New Orleans, the colonel wrote extensively about hereditary theories popular among wealthy slaveholders who viewed humans as improvable through selective breeding, no different from horses or cattle. These theories weren't fringe beliefs but respectable discourse among Southern elites who justified slavery through pseudoscientific racism. The colonel took these ideas to their logical extreme. If enslaved populations could be bred for physical strength and endurance, he reasoned, why not introduce those traits into his own family line? The twisted logic ignored fundamental moral boundaries, reducing his daughters and Samuel to genetic components in an experiment masked as family planning. Samuel's selection was methodical. Plantation records show the colonel visited Charleston slave markets 3 times in 1853 before purchasing him. Auction house documentation describes Samuel as exceptional physical development, estimated 25 years, skilled in field labor, no history of flight or resistance. The colonel paid premium prices, $800, nearly double typical market rates, suggesting he viewed Samuel as investment rather than labor. Contemporary auction advertisements emphasized breeding potential alongside work capacity, treating enslaved humans as livestock whose reproductive value added to their purchase price. What made the colonel's program particularly disturbing was how he systematized it. Dr. Webb's medical journals, discovered in 2017, reveal consultations beginning in January 1854, where Ashford discussed optimizing fertility windows and ensuring successful conception outcomes. Webb's discomfort seeps through clinical language. The colonel's proposals regarding his daughters raise grave moral concerns, yet he insists these measures serve higher family purposes. I document under protest but lack authority to intervene in household matters beyond my medical capacity. The doctor's position reflects broader complicity. Webb continued visiting Ashford Manor monthly, conducting examinations that facilitated the colonel's program, while maintaining enough distance to preserve his conscience. When questioned decades later by his grandson, Webb allegedly admitted, "We all knew something unconscionable was happening at that plantation, but challenging a man of the colonel's standing meant professional and social destruction, so we looked away." The colonel's daughters had no agency to resist. In 1850s Mississippi, unmarried women remained under absolute paternal authority. They couldn't own property, couldn't leave home without permission, couldn't appeal to legal systems designed to uphold patriarchal power. The colonel effectively imprisoned his daughters in their own home, transforming Ashford Manor from sanctuary into laboratory for his breeding experiment. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantations describe how the Ashford daughters vanished from society after spring 1856. Social invitations went unanswered. Church attendance ceased. The family's isolation became so complete that rumors spread through the county, whispers about illness, scandal, even madness. But nobody investigated. Nobody challenged the colonel's authority over his household. The silence was total and deliberate. Samuel's position was even more precarious. As enslaved property, he existed entirely at the colonel's mercy. Whether he participated willingly or under coercion remains impossible to determine from surviving records that never acknowledged enslaved people's perspectives. Plantation punishment logs from 1854 to 1856 contain no entries for Samuel, unusual given that overseers typically documented even minor infractions. The absence suggests either exemplary behavior or, more likely, that Samuel occupied a special category within the plantation hierarchy that exempted him from standard discipline. The colonel's methodology extended beyond coercion to documentation manipulation. He maintained separate ledgers, one for official plantation records, another locked in his private study. The hidden ledger, discovered in 2019 when descendants renovated the manor's foundation, contained fertility tracking, pregnancy confirmations, and birth predictions written in cipher. The colonel coded his daughters' names as Subject A, Subject B, and Subject C, while Samuel appeared as Genetic Source Prime. The dehumanizing terminology reduced all participants to experimental variables in a program focused entirely on outcomes. What drove this obsession wasn't just racial theories, but dynastic ambition combined with grief-fueled delusion. The colonel believed he was creating a family line that would dominate Mississippi society for generations. Children, who combined white social status with physical attributes he associated with enslaved populations. The racist ideology that justified slavery also enabled him to view this forced mixing as enhancement rather than abuse, as strategic planning rather than systematic sexual violence. By late 1856, the colonel's program achieved its intended results. His daughters were all pregnant. The photograph captured that moment of terrible success, a family portrait that documented not celebration, but completion of the first phase in a multi-generational project that would define the Ashford name for over a century, though not in ways the colonel anticipated. The dynasty he created would indeed last generations, but as a legacy of trauma, secrecy, and genetic evidence that eventually exposed everything he tried to hide. Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine Ashford entered their father's breeding program as adolescent girls who had already lost their mother. What they endured between spring 1856 and the births in 1857 remains largely undocumented in official records, a silence that speaks volumes about how systematic sexual coercion was erased from family histories. Their voices were stolen twice, first by the program itself, then by descendants who sanitized their stories to protect the family reputation. The few surviving fragments paint portraits of young women trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Elizabeth, the eldest at 17, appears in pre-1856 correspondence as educated and literary. Letters to cousins in Mobile discuss poetry, plantation management, and ambitions to travel. After spring 1856, her correspondence ceases entirely. Family records note only that Elizabeth withdrew from external engagements due to delicate health, euphemistic language that masked forced isolation. Margaret, 16, showed artistic talent according to family Bibles that recorded not just births and deaths but personal notes. An entry from 1854 mentions her watercolor paintings being displayed at county social events. A teacher's letter praised her exceptional eye for detail and emotional depth in portraiture. These talents vanished after 1856. No paintings from Margaret survive past that year, as if the program erased not just her voice but her creative spirit. Catherine, only 15, remained the most vulnerable. Plantation ledgers note she was of fragile constitution and prone to melancholy following her mother's passing. Making her the youngest participant in the Colonel's program reveals the depths of his moral corruption. Age provided no protection when patriarchal authority combined with breeding obsession. Her youth made her trauma perhaps the most profound, forced into reproduction before she could understand what was being stolen from her. The sisters' relationships with each other during this period remain unknowable. Did they find solidarity in shared suffering? Did isolation fracture their bonds? Family letters from decades later, written by their daughters, contain cryptic references to the great silence our mothers maintained, and wounds too deep for words between sisters who loved each other but could not speak of what connected them. The silence suggests trauma so profound that even among themselves, the sisters couldn't articulate what they endured. Samuel's interactions with the Ashford daughters are even more obscured. Power dynamics made any semblance of consent impossible. He was enslaved property, they were imprisoned daughters, and the Colonel controlled every aspect of their lives. Whether Samuel viewed the daughters as fellow victims or resented his position as instrument of their father's obsession, whether moments of genuine connection existed amid coercion, these questions haunt the historical record. The Colonel's program denied agency to all 4 young people it exploited, reducing them to biological functions in service of dynastic ambition. Dr. Webb's medical journals provide the coldest documentation of what transpired. Monthly visits to Ashford Manor beginning in June 1856 note, confirmed conceptions in all 3 subjects progressing as planned. The clinical detachment suggests Webb compartmentalized moral objections to continue his role. He recorded due dates, monitored health conditions, and prepared for simultaneous deliveries with the emotional distance of a veterinarian tracking livestock breeding. Only once did his composure crack, in a November 1856 entry. The youngest weeps constantly. I can offer no comfort that doesn't implicate me further in this abomination. The births occurred within 3 weeks of each other in March-April 1857. Webb attended all 3 deliveries at Ashford Manor with the Colonel present throughout, controlling the documentation, ensuring the babies were registered according to his predetermined plan. Birth certificates filed with Noxubee County list the children as orphaned relations, their actual parentage obscured behind legal fictions. The Colonel had spent months arranging with compliant officials. Elizabeth delivered first, a boy named Thomas, documented as nephew taken under family protection. Margaret followed with a girl named Sarah after the Colonel's mother, similarly listed as orphaned relation. Catherine, whose delivery Webb described as complicated by the mother's extreme youth and psychological distress, gave birth to a boy named James, completing the Colonel's first generation of his enhanced bloodline. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The immediate aftermath remains undocumented. How the sisters adjusted to motherhood forced upon them. How they processed trauma while raising children born from systematic coercion. How they navigated the Colonel's continued control over their lives. All this vanished into the silence that wealthy families weaponized to protect their reputations. Later accounts suggest the sisters never married, remaining at Ashford Manor to raise their children under their father's supervision, perpetuating the isolation that began in 1856. What's known is that the Colonel treated the 3 children as legitimate heirs. They were educated, integrated into family business operations, and eventually inherited portions of the plantation. DNA testing in 2020 confirmed what genealogical research suggested. All 3 children shared the same father, Samuel, and had mothers who were half-sisters to each other. The genetic evidence proved the Colonel's breeding program, while simultaneously exposing the lies embedded in over 160 years of family documentation. The Ashford daughters' silence protected their children from social ostracization in a society that would have destroyed them for their mixed-race heritage had the truth emerged. But that protective silence also allowed the Colonel's program to be forgotten, enabling similar abuses to continue unchallenged across the antebellum South. where breeding programs operated with impunity behind plantation walls. In December 1860, as Southern states began seceding from the Union, Samuel vanished from Ashford Manor's records. The plantation ledger that meticulously documented every enslaved person's movements, tasks, and value simply stopped mentioning him. No sale receipt exists. No death record was filed. No runaway notice appeared in county newspapers. Samuel disappeared as if he'd never existed, precisely as the Colonel intended. Understanding Samuel's erasure requires examining what the Colonel gained from his disappearance. By late 1860, the breeding program's first phase was complete. 3 children had been born, documented as legitimate Ashford heirs, and were being raised within the family structure. Samuel's continued presence threatened to expose the truth. His physical resemblance to the children would become undeniable as they aged. The Colonel needed Samuel gone before anyone connected the genetic evidence standing in plain sight. Oral histories collected from descendants of other enslaved families at Ashford Manor suggest Samuel was sold off plantation in a private transaction never recorded in official documents. One account, documented by researchers in 1986, describes a strong field hand who worked close to the big house being taken away in the night by traders headed to the Deep South. Another fragment mentions a man the Colonel wanted disappeared, being sold to work gangs building levees in Louisiana, locations notorious for deadly conditions where enslaved people rarely survived more than a few years. The lack of documentation wasn't accidental oversight but deliberate strategy. Mississippi law required plantation owners to record slave sales for taxation purposes, but enforcement was minimal when deals involved delicate family circumstances. The Colonel likely paid premium prices for traders willing to handle the transaction off books, ensuring no paper trail connected Samuel to the children he'd been forced to father. Cash transactions, handshake agreements, and destroyed receipts made Samuel vanish from legal existence. What makes Samuel's disappearance particularly haunting is timing. December 1860 placed it at the exact moment national attention focused on secession rather than individual plantation transactions. Political chaos provided perfect cover for erasing someone whose existence threatened the Colonel's carefully constructed fiction. As Mississippi debated joining the Confederacy, who would notice one enslaved man disappearing from a remote plantation? Who would investigate when war was imminent? The Civil War's eruption in April 1861 compounded the erasure. Records from this period became fragmentary as administrative structures collapsed. Plantation ledgers stopped being maintained with pre-war precision. County offices burned during Union occupation. Documents were deliberately destroyed to prevent seizure by federal troops. The chaos of war allowed wealthy families like the Ashfords to bury inconvenient truths beneath layers of legitimate destruction and wartime confusion. Colonel Ashford himself died in September 1862 from wounds sustained defending Vicksburg. His death closed the only direct link to the breeding program's planning and execution. Without his testimony, the full scope of what transpired at Ashford Manor became speculation rather than documented fact. His daughters, already trained in silence, maintained that silence absolutely after his death, protecting their children from scandal even as they inherited the plantation and its terrible legacy. The war's end brought more opportunities for erasure. Reconstruction chaos, particularly in Mississippi, meant genealogical records became unreliable. Families rewrote histories to align with post-war social requirements. The Ashfords presented themselves as loyal Southerners who'd lost their patriarch defending the Confederacy, burying the breeding program beneath narratives of wartime sacrifice and resilience. The 3 children, now adolescents, were positioned as legitimate heirs with no questions about their parentage raised in official contexts. Samuel's fate after leaving Ashford Manor remains unknown. Researchers have traced possible matches in Louisiana work gang records from 1861, where an enslaved man matching Samuel's description died in a levee collapse that summer. Another potential trail leads to Alabama cotton plantations, where a Samuel, approximate age 35, appears briefly before vanishing again. Without confirmed documentation, Samuel's end remains as obscured as his role in the Colonel's program, another voice silenced by systems designed to treat enslaved people as disposable instruments rather than human beings whose stories mattered. What's certain is that Samuel never saw the children he'd been forced to father. He never knew they survived, prospered, and eventually created their own families, unwitting founders of a dynasty built on his genetic contribution and the Colonel's twisted vision. DNA evidence from living descendants confirms Samuel's bloodline persists across 6 generations, but the man himself was denied any relationship with that legacy. He existed solely as genetic source material, used and discarded once his purpose was fulfilled. The Colonel's program succeeded precisely because it exploited systems already in place. Slavery normalized treating humans as breeding stock. Patriarchal authority normalized controlling daughters' reproductive futures. Civil War chaos normalized destroying inconvenient records. Reconstruction's failures normalized wealthy families rewriting their histories without accountability. Each element combined to create perfect conditions for burying the truth beneath layers of legal fiction, strategic silence, and deliberate erasure. Samuel's disappearance represents countless similar erasures across the antebellum and Civil War South. How many enslaved people vanished from records when their existence became inconvenient? How many breeding programs operated behind plantation walls with participants eliminated once they'd served their purpose? The absence of documentation doesn't mean these abuses didn't occur. It means powerful people successfully weaponized record-keeping systems to hide crimes that should have been prosecuted, but instead were protected. Samuel's silence echoes across 165 years, a reminder that historical absence often indicates not insignificance, but successful suppression of voices that powerful people wanted erased. The 3 children born from the Colonel's breeding program, Thomas, Sarah, and James, grew up believing the family fiction. They were orphaned cousins, taken in by benevolent relatives, raised alongside each other at Ashford Manor, under the care of their mothers whom they called Aunt. The elaborate deception shaped their entire lives, creating a family structure built on lies that none of them questioned, until DNA evidence 160 years later exposed the truth their mothers died protecting. Thomas Ashford, the eldest, inherited the primary plantation holdings when he came of age in 1878. He married Catherine Sinclair, daughter of a neighboring plantation owner, in 1880, a union that solidified the Ashford family's position in post-Reconstruction Mississippi society. The marriage produced 4 children, effectively laundering the Colonel's breeding program through generations of socially acceptable unions that buried the mixed-race origins beneath layers of white respectability. Sarah Ashford never married, instead managing the manor house and raising her younger cousin's children after her aunt mothers passed away. Census records from 1880-1900 list her as head of household, single female, independent means, unusual status for a woman in that era, but explained by substantial inheritance. Sarah's choice to remain unmarried might have been personal preference or traumatic response to what she eventually learned about her own origins. Family letters suggest she knew more than her brothers, carrying knowledge that made conventional life impossible. James Ashford moved to New Orleans in 1882, establishing a shipping business that diversified family wealth beyond agriculture. He married twice, first to Marie Beaufort, who died in childbirth in 1885, then to Rebecca Thornton, who bore 3 children. James's business success, combined with geographical distance from Ashford Manor, allowed him to escape the plantation's psychological weight while still benefiting from its economic foundation, built on slavery and breeding programs. The second generation, the Colonel's great-grandchildren, grew up in the late 1800s and early 1900s completely ignorant of their heritage. They attended elite schools, joined respected social organizations, and married into prominent Southern families. The breeding program's genetic legacy expressed itself in subtle ways: unusual height, distinctive physical features, and characteristics that occasionally prompted whispered speculation about Spanish blood or Creole heritage in family lines. These socially acceptable explanations allowed the Ashfords to maintain their position, while genetics insisted on revealing truths nobody wanted to acknowledge. The photograph from 1856 surfaced briefly in 1923, when Thomas Ashford's grandson, reviewing family archives for a genealogical project, discovered it in a locked trunk. According to his diary obtained by researchers in 2018, he found the image disturbing in ways I cannot articulate, and noted the inscription on the back: "The foundation of our continuation, Spring 1856. He consulted with Sarah's daughter, then in her 60s, who allegedly told him, "Some family history should remain buried." That photograph represents pain better left in the past. He destroyed what he thought was the only copy, but he was wrong. A second copy survived in the possession of Dr. Webb's descendants. The physician had commissioned a duplicate before his death in 1892, leaving it with instructions that sparked decades of family debate. Webb's great-granddaughter, interviewed in 2020, described finding the photograph alongside her ancestors' journals. He wrote that someday the truth would matter more than protection. He wanted evidence preserved even though he'd failed to stop what happened. His guilt haunted him for 40 years. The third generation came of age during the Jim Crow era, when racial hierarchies were being violently reinforced through law and custom. Any revelation about the family's mixed-race origins would have triggered social destruction. The silence that began as the Colonel's control mechanism became survival strategy for descendants who had everything to lose from truth. They maintained white identity, enjoyed white privilege, and passed down fragments of family myth that erased Samuel and the breeding program entirely. Occasional whispers surfaced throughout the 20th century. A genealogist working on prominent Mississippi families in 1956 noted inconsistencies in Ashford family documentation from the 1850s, but dropped the investigation after being told certain family matters are private and should remain so. Ian, an anthropology student researching plantation architecture in 1973, interviewed elderly black residents near former Ashford properties who mentioned complicated family secrets, but wouldn't elaborate. Each time someone approached the truth, pressure from the Ashford family's descendants, who maintained wealth and influence, shut down inquiry. The dynasty's continued success validated the Colonel's program from a purely functional standpoint, even as it represented moral catastrophe. The children produced through forced breeding prospered, married well, created business empires, and established family branches across the South. Their success wasn't despite the program but partly because of it. The Colonel's wealth, social position, and careful documentation manipulation provided foundations that subsequent generations built upon without knowing the true source. By the early 2000s, 6 generations separated living descendants from the 1856 photograph and the breeding program it documented. Most family members knew nothing beyond sanitized histories presented in occasional genealogical publications. The truth survived only in fragments. Webb's journals, the duplicate photograph, oral histories among descendants of enslaved families, and cryptic references in letters written by people who knew but couldn't speak openly. The dynasty the Colonel created succeeded in perpetuating his bloodline, but failed in its ultimate goal. He wanted to create a family that dominated through enhanced genetics. Instead, he created a family haunted by secrets, defined by silence, and eventually exposed by the very genetic evidence he'd tried to hide. The dynasty stands as monument not to his vision, but to the systematic cruelty of slavery, the complicity of entire communities, and the resilience of truth that refuses to stay buried forever. The revolution came not from historians or genealogists, but from science. In 2019, when multiple Ashford descendants participated in commercial genetic testing services, their results triggered algorithmic matches that couldn't be explained by official family trees. Cousins who should have shared predictable genetic overlap showed unexpected African ancestry percentages. Relationships mapped as third or fourth cousins registered as closer relatives. The data demanded explanations that 7 generations of silence had successfully suppressed. Jennifer Ashford Morrison, a 6th-generation descendant living in Atlanta, first noticed the discrepancies. She'd submitted DNA samples expecting to confirm her documented English and Scottish heritage. Instead, results showed 11% West African ancestry and genetic matches to black families she'd never heard of. Her initial response was disbelief, assuming laboratory error. But when she contacted matched individuals, they shared their own family histories, oral traditions about ancestors who worked at Ashford Manor, whispered stories about complicated relationships between the Ashford family and enslaved people, and persistent rumors about breeding programs. If this story has gripped you so far, leave a like. It helps the Ashford daughters' story reach more people. The genetic revelation prompted Jennifer to investigate her family's documentation. She discovered inconsistencies immediately: birth certificates with suspiciously vague parentage notes, census records that didn't align with family Bibles, and gaps in documentation from the 1850s that previous genealogists had attributed to Civil War record destruction. The more she researched, the more obvious the cover-up became. Her family's history wasn't lost to time, it was deliberately erased. Jennifer's research connected her to Dr. Malcolm Webb, great-great-grandson of the physician who'd attended the Ashford family. Malcolm had inherited his ancestors' journals and the duplicate 1856 photograph. struggling for years with whether to reveal what they contained. He'd reached out to Ashford descendants multiple times since 2010, only to be met with threats of legal action for defamation. Jennifer's contact, driven by DNA evidence rather than accusations, finally gave him someone willing to hear the truth. The photograph Malcolm shared devastated Jennifer. Seeing her fourth great-grandfather Colonel Ashford standing beside three young women and Samuel, knowing now what that image documented, transformed abstract genealogical research into visceral understanding of her family's foundation. The inscription, "The foundation of our continuation, spring 1856, suddenly revealed its terrible meaning. Her bloodline traced directly through that forced breeding program, making her existence itself evidence of what transpired. Jennifer and Malcolm partnered with genetic genealogists and historians to map the complete scope of the Colonel's dynasty. They identified over 200 living descendants, many unaware of their connection to the breeding program. Genetic testing confirmed that all traced back to Samuel through the three daughters. Thomas, Sarah, and James were half-siblings who shared a father. The DNA evidence proved what documentation had obscured. The Colonel had systematically forced his daughters into a reproductive program that created multiple family lines descended from one enslaved man. The revelation fractured the extended Ashford family. Some descendants embraced the truth, acknowledging the trauma underlying their heritage and seeking connections with black family branches who shared their genetic ancestry. Others rejected the evidence entirely, insisting the DNA results represented contamination or conspiracy rather than historical reality. Several branches threatened legal action to prevent publication of findings, arguing that exposing the breeding program defamed ancestors who couldn't defend themselves. The most painful conflicts emerged around racial identity. Descendants who'd lived as white, benefiting from white privilege, identifying with white Southern culture, suddenly confronted mixed-race heritage hidden for 7 generations. Some embraced newly discovered black cousins and began learning about African American history as part of their own story. Others refused to acknowledge genetic evidence, clinging to family myths despite scientific proof of their inaccuracy. Black descendants of other enslaved families at Ashford Manor responded to the revelations with complex emotions. Some expressed satisfaction that truth finally emerged, validating oral histories their families had maintained despite white society's dismissal. Others felt angry that it took DNA testing to force acknowledgement of atrocities black communities had known about for generations. The asymmetry was obvious. White descendants needed scientific proof to believe what black descendants had passed down through family memory for 160 years. Genetic genealogists working on the case noted similar patterns across the South. Breeding programs operated at numerous plantations, creating mixed-race descendants who were documented as white to preserve family reputations. DNA testing was exposing these programs systematically, revealing that many prominent white Southern families had African ancestry hidden through strategic manipulation of genealogical records. The Ashford case represented hundreds of similar discoveries, rewriting understanding of American history and racial categories. The science was irrefutable. Genetic markers confirmed Samuel's paternity of the Colonel's 3 grandchildren. Chromosomal analysis showed exactly how the bloodline spread across 6 generations. DNA matching connected white and black family branches through shared ancestry that official records had deliberately obscured. The Colonel's breeding program succeeded in creating a dynasty, but genetic testing ensured that dynasty could no longer hide behind the lies that founded it. By 2023, over 100 Ashford descendants had submitted DNA samples and confirmed their connection to the breeding program. The family tree, reconstructed using genetic evidence, documented 7 generations descended from 3 young women forced into their father's reproductive experiment and an enslaved man who never knew the legacy he unwillingly created. Truth encoded in DNA couldn't be erased, rewritten, or hidden, only finally acknowledged after 165 years of deliberate silence. The Colonel's program wasn't unique. Recent historical research and DNA evidence reveal that forced breeding programs operated across the antebellum South, hidden behind plantation walls and erased from official records through the same strategies the Ashfords employed. Understanding the broader context transforms the 1856 photograph from isolated aberration into documented example of systematic practices that wealthy slaveholders implemented with impunity. Breeding programs targeting enslaved people were common and legally sanctioned. After the international slave trade ended in 1808, American slavery became self-sustaining through natural reproduction. supplemented by forced breeding designed to increase enslaved populations and enhance desired traits. Plantation owners treated humans like livestock, selecting individuals for physical strength, docility, or other characteristics, then forcing reproduction through various coercive methods, ranging from incentives to outright violence. What made the Ashford case distinctive wasn't forced breeding of enslaved people. That was normalized throughout the South, but the Colonel's extension of breeding logic to his own daughters. He applied principles commonly accepted for enslaved populations to white family members, crossing boundaries that even other slaveholders recognized as transgressive. The ideological framework enabling breeding programs was so entrenched that the Colonel could imagine applying it to his daughters while maintaining his standing in respectable society. Historical records document similar cases where wealthy families engaged in reproductive programs involving white family members, though usually with more distance than the Ashford case. Young white women were pressured into relationships with enslaved men to produce children who would be claimed as legitimate heirs, or used to expand enslaved populations. These arrangements were kept secret through elaborate documentation manipulation, legal fictions, and community silence that protected powerful families from consequences. Thomas Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings represents the most famous example of white male slaveholders engaging in forced reproductive relationships with enslaved women. DNA evidence confirmed Jefferson fathered children with Hemings, creating a mixed-race lineage that Jefferson's white descendants denied for over 200 years. The Hemings case differs from Ashford's in involving an enslaved woman rather than free white daughters, but parallels exist in documentation erasure, family denial, and truth emerging only through genetic evidence. Research by historians focused on plantation records reveals coded language identifying breeding programs. Phrases like increase policy, genetic enhancement, reproduction management, and bloodline improvement appear in private correspondence between plantation owners discussing systematic approaches to forced reproduction. Medical records from plantation physicians document fertility tracking, pregnancy monitoring, and interventions designed to maximize reproduction, treating humans as agricultural production requiring scientific management. The medical profession's complicity extended beyond individual physicians like Dr. Webb. Medical journals from the 1840s, 1860s contain articles discussing reproduction management in enslaved populations, offering advice on fertility optimization and genetic selection. These publications treated forced breeding as legitimate medical concern, providing scientific veneer to practices that constituted systematic sexual violence. The medicalization of breeding programs enabled physicians to participate while maintaining professional distance from moral implications. Legal structures supported these programs through laws that gave slaveholders absolute authority over enslaved people's bodies. Enslaved women had no legal recourse against sexual violence. Children born from rape were automatically enslaved, their existence increasing the slaveholders' wealth. Laws protecting white women from sexual violence explicitly excluded enslaved women, creating a legal framework where rape was simultaneously crime and property management, depending on victims' race and status. Even more disturbing were cases where white families used breeding programs to resolve inheritance disputes or create heirs when male lineages failed. Genealogical research uncovered instances of white widows or unmarried women being pressured into relationships with enslaved men to produce male heirs who could inherit property while being documented as adopted relatives or orphaned kin. These cases remained hidden because exposure would have invalidated property claims and destroyed family reputations. Religious institutions often provided cover for breeding programs. Church records contain baptisms of mixed-race children documented as orphans or foundlings, with suspiciously vague parentage information. Clergy who knew the truth maintained silence, prioritizing wealthy families' donations and social influence over moral responsibilities to protect vulnerable people. The complicity extended from individual ministers to entire denominational structures that avoided confronting slaveholders' abuses. Community-wide silence enabled these programs to operate without interference. Neighbors, business partners, and local officials knew or strongly suspected what transpired at particular plantations, but intervened only in the most extreme cases. And even then, interventions focused on protecting family reputations rather than stopping abuses. The social compact among wealthy white Southerners included mutual protection of secrets that would undermine their collective power. The economic incentives were substantial. Breeding programs increased enslaved populations without purchase costs. with children born into slavery representing pure profit. For families like the Ashfords, breeding programs that incorporated white daughters offered additional benefits, creating mixed-race children who could be documented as white heirs, combining legal inheritance rights with physical attributes the colonel valued, all while expanding family wealth through demographic growth. Post-Civil War, these programs disappeared into historical silence. Reconstruction failed to prosecute former slaveholders for breeding programs, focusing instead on political reconciliation. The lost cause mythology that romanticized antebellum South had no room for acknowledging systematic sexual violence and forced reproduction. Families that participated in breeding programs either buried their records or rewrote family histories to erase evidence of practices that contradicted emerging narratives about genteel plantation culture. Only in recent decades has historical research begun exposing these programs. DNA testing has been crucial, providing evidence that documentary sources destroyed or suppressed. Genetic genealogy projects across the South are revealing unexpected family connections that trace back to forced breeding programs, rewriting understanding of both genealogy and social history. The Ashford case represents documented proof of practices that historians long suspected but couldn't confirm due to destroyed records and family silence. The 1856 photograph in Dr. Webb's journals provide rare contemporary evidence of breeding programs that extended beyond enslaved populations to include white family members forced into participating in their patriarchs' reproductive experiments. In 2021, over 150 descendants of the Ashford breeding program gathered for an unprecedented family reunion in Jackson, Mississippi. The meeting brought together white branches who'd maintained the Ashford name, and black branches descended from other enslaved families at the plantation, all connected through Samuel's bloodline. The gathering represented the first time the family publicly acknowledged the 1856 breeding program and its 165-year legacy of silence, trauma, and complicated kinship. The event was organized by Jennifer Ashford Morrison, working with Marcus Thompson, whose oral family history identified his great-great-great-grandmother as Samuel's half-sister, making him a cousin to the white Ashford descendants. Marcus described learning about the connection. "My grandmother told me stories about Samuel, how he was taken from his family and made to father children with white women at the big house. She said one day we'd find those cousins. I never believed her until DNA proved she was right." The reunion forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths. White descendants had grown up with privilege rooted in their family's wealth, never knowing that wealth came partly from the systematic sexual abuse documented in that 1856 photograph. Black descendants had lived with the knowledge their entire lives, passed down through family stories that white society dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated. The asymmetry of knowledge itself became a point of tension. Why had it taken genetic proof for white descendants to believe what black families had been saying for generations? Some white descendants apologized tearfully for their ancestors' actions. Catherine Ashford James, descended through Thomas's line, spoke publicly, "I can't undo what Colonel Ashford did to his daughters, to Samuel, or to the generations affected by his program, but I can acknowledge it, stop perpetuating the silence, and work to ensure this history is remembered accurately. That's the minimum responsibility I have as someone who benefited from this legacy." Others struggled with the revelation. Robert Ashford, a prominent attorney in Memphis who'd spent his career trading on the family name, initially refused to attend and only changed his mind after pressure from his own children. At the reunion, he admitted, "Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. The Ashford name I've been proud of is built on something I find morally reprehensible. I don't know how to reconcile that." His honesty, though painful, opened space for others to express similar conflicts. The most emotional moments came when descendants met genetic relatives for the first time. Cousins separated by race, geography, and historical silence embraced while acknowledging the circumstances that created their connection. One exchange between Jennifer and Marcus's sister Tanya became symbolic of the reunion's purpose. Tanya told Jennifer, "My ancestor was stolen from his family to serve in your ancestor's breeding program. That trauma echoes through generations, but we're also family now because of it, and maybe that means something." Jennifer responded, "I can't change history, but I can refuse to keep lying about it. You're my family. That's the truth." Not all encounters resolved smoothly. Tensions emerged around reparations and accountability. Some black descendants argued that white family branches should establish financial resources to address ongoing disparities rooted in slavery. White descendants split over this proposal. Some agreed in principle but disputed amounts and implementation. Others rejected any reparations as inappropriate for events 165 years past. These conflicts remained unresolved, reflecting broader national debates about reparations for slavery. Documentary filmmakers captured the 2021 reunion for a project examining how American families confront difficult histories. The resulting film, released in 2023, included interviews with descendants across racial lines, tours of the former Ashford Manor, and analysis by historians and geneticists. The documentary brought national attention to the case, prompting discussions about breeding programs, family secrets, and the ways DNA evidence forces reconsideration of American genealogy. The reunion also created space for descendants to process trauma their ancestors couldn't articulate. Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine Ashford never publicly acknowledged what their father forced upon them. Their silence protected their children, but created generational wounds that descendants are only now beginning to address. Therapy workshops at the reunion helped participants understand inherited trauma, how silence compounds suffering across generations, and ways to break cycles of pain through acknowledgement and connection. Religious elements complicated the reunion. Several white descendants raised in conservative Southern churches struggled to reconcile their faith with ancestors who'd participated in systematic sexual violence. Black descendants, many from Baptist traditions with strong social justice orientations, viewed the breeding program through frameworks of sin and redemption but disagreed on whether forgiveness was possible or appropriate for atrocities of this magnitude. These theological tensions remain ongoing in family conversations. The Ashford descendants' decision to go public with their history sparked similar revelations from other Southern families. Over a dozen families have since acknowledged breeding programs in their genealogies, using the Ashford case as model for how to confront difficult histories without perpetuating silence. Historical societies across the South now actively investigate suspected breeding programs, encouraged by families willing to allow research into previously off-limits archives. Educational initiatives emerged from the reunion. Descendants partnered with universities to develop curriculum materials about breeding programs, using the Ashford case as primary source material. High school and college students now study the 1856 photograph, Dr. Webb's journals, and descendant testimonies as evidence of slavery's full scope, including aspects often excluded from standard history textbooks that focus on cotton production and political conflicts, while minimizing sexual violence and reproductive coercion. The reunion didn't resolve all conflicts or heal all wounds. Some family branches refused to participate, maintaining silence and denying DNA evidence. Legal threats persisted from descendants concerned about damage to the Ashford name. Disagreements over memory, reparations, and public acknowledgement continue dividing the family. But the gathering broke a 165-year silence, allowing truth to be spoken, grief to be processed, and relationships to be built across lines that historical lies had artificially maintained.